Hello, everybody. What a treat it is to have you. Welcome to Queerness in Nature and Other Stories. This is a wonderful treat to have you here. It is the Great Exhibition Road Festival. This is Explore at Home. It is part of the online series of events that are happening. And it's a delight to have you with us. Now, for today's lunchtime, thank you for joining us during your lunchtime. There is a Pride-themed talk where we've got wonderful speakers from lots of the organizations on Exhibition Road, or what we might call the Albertopolis. It's in South Kensington in London. And I'm Dan Vo. I am the co-project manager of the Queer Heritage Collections Network, and I'm also one of the people who coordinate the award-winning LGBTQ tours at the V&A Museum. But today we're going to be joined by folk who are from the Natural History Museum, the Royal Geographical Society, also another colleague of mine from the V&A, and also the Royal Albert Hall. Now, they're going to be sharing what they're doing at their collection, their museum, their organization, their institution that relates to LGBTQ audiences, histories, and research. That's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer plus as well, meaning that so more identities and sexualities included in that as well. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to remind you that today is an interactive discussion, and it'll be great to hear from you. So we've got James and May from the Imperial College team who are looking after the chat. So if you've got questions, or if you've got things that are more of a comment than a question, please do use the YouTube chat function and put your questions and comments in there. They'll be passed on to me, and then I can pass them on to the speakers as well. So please be considerate while you are posting in the chat, though. We will remove anything that disrupts the experience for others. Now, to tell you a little bit more about the Great Exhibition Road Festival, it is a free annual celebration of science and the arts in South Kensington. And this year, we're going to put into our calendars October 9 and 15. That's when you'll see the street teeming with wonderful people, staff and volunteers from each of the organizations, just welcoming you, saying this is what we've got on. So there's going to be activities, lots of color, lots of sparkles even, and a massive celebration of science and the arts, as I said. Now, to keep the conversation going online, in the lead up to that, we're doing things like this, these wonderful chats that are happening online. So the Albertopolis is reawakening right now, and we are starting to maintain that balance between digital and in person. But you can come and visit us, so you can come to see us. Just check the websites for information about booking and also visiting safely. So it's great to see people coming through the door again. And it is Pride Month at the moment. No, Pride Month was June, but this year I think it's stretched out a little bit. It's sort of Pride season as we kind of shift things around. So as part of Pride season, I've asked each of the speakers today to tell us what's happening in their collection, their organization that relates to LGBTQ histories, to audience engagement and all that sort of stuff. So when we welcome you back, you know that what you can come to our organizations to see. So introducing our speakers, in order of appearance today, you're going to see Florence Okoye. Florence is a user researcher and user experience designer at the Natural History Museum. Her work explores how creative methods can be used to understand people's perceptions of natural history and how participatory approaches can both engage and reveal untold stories. Florence, I'm going to actually ask you very quickly, what are we going to look forward to on your talk? What's that tantalizing hook?
Oh, well, it's going to be a smorgasbord of zines, tours, and much, much more.
Oh, fabulous. A smorgasbord for lunchtime. That's perfect. Thank you. Coming up next, we've got Aidan Greatrick, who is a postgraduate fellow from the Royal Geographical Society and also a project officer in the Economic and Social Research Council-funded Impact Acceleration Account project, and it's called Pride in the Field, and it's about promoting inclusive field workspaces for LGBTQ workers in research policy and practice, led by Martin Zabracki at the University of Leeds. Aidan, what have we got coming up from you that's tantalizing?
Well, I'll be talking about how fieldwork helps us make new discoveries about the challenges we all face, but too often LGBTQ people feel excluded from fieldwork settings, or they feel unsafe when in fieldwork. So I'll be talking about how we can change that, and I'm looking forward to it.
Fabulous. Thank you. All right. Maud is an assistant curator in the Furniture, Textiles and Fashion Department at the Victorian Albert Museum. She's previously worked on Mary Quant, the exhibition, and also helped to design the new Design 1900 to Now permanent galleries, which is just recently reopened at the museum. Great to have you with us, Maud. What have you got coming up?
Yeah, so I'll be presenting the new galleries, but also highlight LGBTQ objects that are on display and our latest acquisitions as well.
Ooh, exciting. New things to play with.
Yeah, exactly.
And finally, we've got Liz Harper, who is archive manager at the Royal Albert Hall. She'll have she'll share the stories of all the amazing things that Royal Albert Hall has been doing for the LGBTQ communities in London to create a safe space for performers. So Liz, welcome.
Hi, I'm going to be talking about how our stage has been the focus of LGBTQ performance, and also look forward to Stephen Fry with his pants down.
That is quite a tantalizing hook for us to get to. But also a big happy birthday, I think, is in order.
Thank you. We're 150. So come and visit us. We're reopened.
You don't look a day over 149. So it's each speaker is going to give us a quick presentation now. It's very exciting to find out all the things that are going to be happening on Exhibition Road with a Pride theme. So to kick us off now, of course, I should say, please do keep your questions coming throughout the whole conversation. As people give you presentations, please just drop in your questions and we'll pick them all up at the end. So keep those conversations, those comments, those questions all coming through. So to kick us off, we've got Florence from the Natural History Museum. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so I work as a user experience designer and user researcher at the Natural History Museum. And so that often means I have my fingers in a lot of different pies, particularly around investigating new ways of communicating science and understanding what people need and how we can provide that through our digital platforms. And so really what I'm presenting, as I kind of said before, is kind of a little bit of all the different things that we've been testing out, trying out, and what we've learned about how essentially the queer way of looking at science and nature is incredibly valuable for helping people understand their place in nature and also science as well. So for context, when you're working in a natural history museum, there's a couple of questions that always seem to be coming up. And these are just a few of them. So questions like, how do we make our narratives relevant to people? How do we connect people to nature? What do people already know about topics like climate change and biodiversity? What are people even interested in? How can we make our science something that everyone can be involved in? And I think particularly for those of us from marginalized backgrounds, there's always the question of how might we intervene in the discourse that's happening in the public domain. And I think when it comes to the question of queering natural history, even in the more kind of standard, more basic questions, there's some really interesting connections. And I'm particularly drawing on a really great framework that William Letts created in his paper, Queering Science, Using Sexuality Theory and Research to Critique the Natural Sciences. Now, he actually creates like a framework with 7 points. But I think the 5 that are particularly prescient and in many ways the easiest for us to address as a fairly small but dedicated team are the following. So one of the things that kind of queering natural history or queering science involves is, well, quite frankly, examining the ways that LGBTQIA+ people have been kind of hidden from science and from the narratives of history of science. It also includes really thinking about the ways that science has been used as a kind of a queer-phobic enforcer. And I think there's many of us who are queer who have definitely experienced those usual narratives of like, you're wrong, you're unnatural. And in some ways, part of the scientific narrative has also been used to justify that. And so so when we're talking about queering natural history, part of that has to involve also being critical about the role that science has in doing that. There's also, however, the importance of looking at science as a site of queer resistance, right? So the ways that actually many of us in our community, kind of when we have a much deeper understanding of, say, chromosomes or hormones, we use these to explode myths about gender, about culture, about history. And bringing that to light is also a part of queering science, and in this case, obviously, queering natural history, and in a way kind of nicely addresses and critiques the way that science has sometimes been used as that queer-phobic enforcer. There's also really kind of examining, when we're talking to the broader public, the way in which like these different narratives play out in reality for queer people. And I don't think any of us are ignorant or have not seen the way that, for example, bad faith arguments using woefully incorrect, very simplistic understandings of science have been used and weaponized, for example, especially against trans people, and certainly around the world against kind of all members of the LGBTQ IA plus community. And things that might seem kind of maybe more innocent or more like quite simple questions actually aren't when it comes to the lived experience of those of us within the queer community. And finally, and this is where like my inner academic gets all excited, you know, when we're talking about queering science, queering natural history, you know, one of the things that this also brings to light is really changing the way we understand and think about truth and the way we get to truth. But that's all the deep stuff out of the way. You know, also the reality is that queering natural history is just a good, fun, cool thing to do, right? So with that in mind, what actually is it that we've been working on within the Natural History Museum? So for one thing, there's definitely lots of online content. If you go onto the website, if you go onto the Discover section, you can see a range of articles, which in some ways are really addressing that very first aspect of queering natural history, you know, bringing light to the queer researchers, to those working in the present and those working in the past. So here we have examples of like the amazing Alex Bond, who is a curator based at Natural History Museum in Tring. And we also have the story about Franz Nopska, who was an amazing, groundbreaking paleontologist. We've also done interventions like the Queer Natural History Tour, which was super cool, and that was really spearheaded by Josh Davis from the digital team again. And I think what was particularly lovely about this is we kind of used a collaborative approach to this. So there was the initial content, the initial ideas of what stories we wanted to tell, and we made sure we involved members of our community to critique the narratives that we were telling, to give us more ideas for the kind of questions, the kind of content that they would expect to hear about and to learn about on such a tour. And also thinking from that more intersectional perspective, you know, they also gave really practical insights about, I mean, even the physical accessibility of the tour itself. And yeah, and this has been hosted several times at the Natural History Museum, often during the late event. There have been kind of other like trail versions available at some other events. And also you can now go and watch a version, the virtual tour right now up on our YouTube channel. And that was really made thanks to the amazing Lizzie Tilley, who's head of the digital studios in the digital team. And what other workshops, what other interventions gave it away there? Well, one of them are a bunch of zine workshops. So one of the things that it's really interesting to investigate when we really to understand what do people actually understand from these kind of interventions? What do they think? What are their mental models of this really cool, exciting information that we're giving them about sexuality and gender and queerness and everything good and interesting that you can actually find in the natural world? And these have been, again, really cool because they're a way of both kind of communicating to people the true queerness of nature, and also because it's a discursive activity. So people learn from each other, they have really interesting conversations, they create a bunch, and through that process end up creating a bunch of cool zines that they can take away with them. And again, just anecdotally speaking, you can really see the shift in how people understand themselves, understand the natural world, understand science, understand the topics that maybe might not apply directly to them, but it gives them a good insight into other people's lived experiences and teaches them about science. That's one of the cool things about the power of zines, as it were. And so I've just decided to include some really great quotes from the folks who've been part of, whether it's the tour or the zine workshops. And they've definitely shown things like, you know, people really beginning to see the diversity of, say, sexual behavior and sex differences when it comes to, say, the way that different animals have sexual intercourse, or the way that different animals use sex. In some ways that kind of almost be quite similar to us, and in other ways maybe completely different, but it really destroys any sense of, like, say, gender binaries, or any sense that sex is solely for procreation, for example, which are really key, as thinking again about that framework that I earlier pointed to. There's also been some really interesting insights from people as they've begun to understand that kind of science itself is a cultural phenomenon. It is not so truly objective, right? Scientists come in with their own biases, and they begin to understand how that has affected things like even the way dinosaurs have been named, or the way that, say, natural history museums display certain flora and fauna. But as you know, I kind of just want to end on what I think is a lovely summation of the impact that this work can have on our visitors. But yeah, especially for those who've been marginalized on the basis of their gender expression or sexuality. And it's this really beautiful quote from someone who was part of our workshops when we were designing the LGBTQ natural history tour. And it was someone who just wanted to say, you know, thank you. Some of us were just chatting after the session, saying how much we appreciated having a space to talk about these things we think about so much, and that it would also be put to use as well. So when it comes to these interventions, you know, yes, they're cool, they're fun, they're exciting, and they're also just super, super important for so many of us who've been marginalized on the basis of our sexuality, of our gender, as well as being able to better communicate science, how it works, what it actually is, and the true queerness of the natural world. So thank you very much for listening. That's all from me. And now I am going to hand over to Aidan. So Aidan, over to you now.
Hey, Florence, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I felt like I learned so much. So yeah, my name is Aidan, and I'm here to talk about the Pride in the Field project, which through expert knowledge aims to promote LGBTQ plus inclusion for researchers, for activists, and for students who carry out field research all over the world. So it was great to hear from Florence about the work the Natural History Museum are doing to promote creative and participatory projects. And I think one of the things that Florence picked up on there around how LGBTQ plus people are so often hidden from science really resonated with, I think, some of the things that I'm going to talk about now. And I think just a thought experiment I often try to use to get people thinking about this is to consider what David Attenborough, that famous natural historian, what his career might have looked like if he was LGBTQ plus. What challenges might he have faced working in some of the settings he works in? Do you think that he'd have been able to have as successful a career if he were part of the LGBTQ plus community? And I think as geographers, as field workers, as conservationists, artists, we are often required to work in field settings that can be hostile to LGBTQ plus people and that push LGBTQ plus people away from those sorts of opportunities. Field research, however, does provide a whole range of opportunities for people, for science, for research. Being involved in fieldwork can lead to new discoveries. It can help raise awareness of pressing issues and inform the public about other cultures, events, and situations. So it makes sense that we should want everybody to contribute to this work. The more people are free to be involved, the more likely it is that we will make new discoveries and find innovative solutions to the challenges we face. But sadly, this is not always the case, and it's not always easy for LGBTQ plus people to participate in fieldwork. Fieldwork can be a very difficult and dangerous thing. And it is this point that our project is trying to address, what Pride in the Field is trying to address. We want universities, institutions, organizations to be more proactive in thinking about the challenges that queer researchers face. And we're partnered, for example, with the LGBTQ plus Field Network, who are an incredible organization set up by two biologists after one of the founders, Sarah, experienced anti-gay violence and discrimination when carrying out research on primates in Uganda. And her example, I think, her experience is a kind of example of what we're trying to address here. She's deeply passionate for conservationism. She has the expertise and skills to help protect endangered wildlife. But after this experience and without much support from her institutions or her research team, she considered giving up on the profession and taking her knowledge and her expertise away from conservationism. But despite this, it was out of this experience that she and her colleague Will founded the LGBTQ+ Field Network. And it's this organization that we're supporting through Pride in the Field at Leeds University. And we're the first project of its kind to focus on supporting the needs and activities of field workers who are identified or affiliated with the LGBTQ+ community. And we're working to produce expert knowledge about the challenges that LGBTQ+ researchers face in the field so that we can support global organizations, universities, research teams to address the discrimination facing LGBTQ+ researchers and to find better ways and more proactive ways of making fieldwork more inclusive. So LGBTQ+ researchers working in academia, but also in institutions like the Royal Geographical Society, in archaeology, in natural history, in the arts, face difficult decisions when working in field settings. In my own experience, carrying out research on asylum seeking in countries like Turkey and Lebanon, I felt the need to keep my sexuality hidden, modifying my own behavior. Other researchers that we've spoken to have faced psychological challenges around feeling the need to return to the closet to keep their sexuality hidden when doing field work. I think this also speaks to a lack of existing support on the part of institutions who often expect LGBTQ+ researchers to take on the burden of these risks in a way that can put people off opportunities, affecting careers and general feelings of equality and inclusion, and undermining our ability to contribute to knowledge, touching on some of the things that Florence, you were talking about earlier. So in tackling this, we are working to promote safe spaces for LGBTQ+ researchers in field settings. We are establishing a secure online platform that researchers will be able to access in order to share resources and information to help find support in emergency situations. Information will also be provided to help people know their rights and to plan accordingly in order to avoid greater risks in the field. And we're also developing tools and resources and training toolkits to help make sure that institutions can be more proactive in addressing the risks that LGBTQ+ researchers face, including through risk assessments and toolkits that support inclusive fieldwork. Now, our project also raises some questions, I think, that will apply to everyone thinking about this around inclusion and visibility. Sometimes being LGBTQ+ inclusive can be all about making LGBTQ+ people more visible. But in fieldwork contexts, this isn't always the answer based on some of the conversations we've had with field researchers. So when we think about inclusion, we need to think about people's different experiences and acknowledge that visibility might be a privilege for some that carries different risks for others. And because of this, we think it's important to think about inclusivity as a way of meeting people where they are. It should not be about expecting LGBTQ+ people to be a certain way or to assume that LGBTQ+ people will all face the same challenges. Just like we each make individual decisions about what makes us feel more or less safe when planning trips, having an inclusive approach to fieldwork also requires flexibility, adaptability. It's also about affirming the right of students, staff, researchers to be involved in field research and creating structures of support that are proactive, that make people feel welcomed. And so expanding on this point a bit, and on behalf of my colleague Martin, who sadly couldn't be here today, I wanted to share some insights from his research on queer monuments and memorials, which is focused on Warsaw, Amsterdam, and New York, where specific memorials for LGBTQ+ rights activists and movements have been erected. And his research shows how gay pride monuments, or monuments to LGBTQ+ people in public spaces, act as a conversation piece to question normative spaces, including spaces of research. But doing research on inclusivity, whilst inclusive research practice in the field is being challenged or compromised by homophobia or transphobia, reveals how these processes are iterative. They are multifaceted and inform one another in ambiguous ways. And in the case of the Homo monument in Amsterdam, which Martin talks about in this article cited here, his research shows how inclusion can also produce its own exclusions, specifically for Black, brown, bisexual, and trans people. So when thinking about visibility and inclusion for LGBTQ+ people in field settings, we need to recognize as well this ambiguity and intersectionality, and not reach for a fixed view of what visibility and inclusion might look like. So yeah, that is briefly kind of a snapshot of the project. I'm sure there'll be time to talk more about it in the Q&A. But this is very much an ongoing conversation, and we have a whole set of resources for anyone who's interested in learning more, including the Pride in the Field blog series, which is being kindly supported by the Royal Geographic Society's website, Geography Directions. And I would also encourage you to follow our partner organisation, LGBTQ Field Network, on Twitter to find out more about the great work they're doing. And please do get in touch with me on Twitter or via email if you'd like to find out more. It'd be great to hear from you and to think about how we can work together on this really, really important issue. So that's the end of my slide. And up next is Maud from the V&A, and I'm very excited to hear your talk.
Hi, thank you, Aidan. That was great and sounds like absolutely essential work. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, as Aidan said, I'm an assistant curator at the V&A, and I'm here to present Design 1900 to Know, which is a gallery refresh project we just opened in a gallery mid-June, so it's a month old. If you move on to the next slide, please. I'll talk about how the gallery is hosted in the museum's previous 20th century gallery, and now presents 250 examples of design. So from furniture to fashion, including ceramics, graphics, digital, architecture, you name it. The objects range from 1900 to today, and are presented through a bold new curatorial narrative. So Design 1900 to Know aims to tell a story of design and society, and doing that by exploring narratives that are broad, international, and inclusive. But I won't bore you any longer, because I know that what you're interested in is LGBTQ plus narratives. So I've prepared a selection of objects solely focusing on this. So let's dive right in. So the first object you see here is a set of shoes that were designed by the French-Egyptian high-end fashion designer and shoe designer Christian Louboutin. So in the late 70s, Louboutin immersed himself in Paris in his punk and gay subcultures and scene. And there, that is a bit less known, but he starred in the cult and underground 1979 movie Race Depp, which was subtitled The Homosexual Century. So that's a movie that argued that gay liberation had its roots in the mid-19th century, and I really recommend watching it. If we move on to the next slide, you will see two pattern dress fabrics that were designed about 1928. They were manufactured by Tricot Chanel, that were created by the infamous Coco Chanel. And the reason we're talking about her today is because Coco Chanel is known as a bisexual woman. So in addition to have had many liaisons with artists such like Salvador Dali, that we'll be talking about in a minute, she also had a relationship with women such as like her first clients, like Emmeline d'Alençon, but also many comedians. So if we move on, we'll talk about Dali. So these two objects are also on display in the new galleries. And the reason why I'm including Dali is because there have been long discussions about an alleged relationship between Salvador Dali and his friend, the Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca. And those allegations are based on a passionate correspondence between the two men, but also on ambiguous interviews he's been giving. The other reason I'm bringing this slide up is because the sofa on the left is inspired by the lips of the icon that is Mae West. And Mae West wrote a play that was called The Drag. And the topic of that play was the life of a closeted gay socialite. It was a really interesting play in the sense that the cast was composed of gay actors that beforehand were not cast as speaking actors, and so as you can imagine, it was quite scandalous, and the play was banned after 10 representations only. Moving on, we've got a set of 3 posters here. The central one is the one we're interested in too. So there's a series of posters was made in 1993 by the fashion brand United Colors of Benetton. And the central image speaks of the HIV epidemic that swept the world in the 80s and early 90s. It also comments on the stigma of being diagnosed with the disease. As you can see, HIV positive is tattooed on the skin of the model here. The last slide I want to show you is a series of flags. The first one, some of you may recognize, is a flag titled Progress. This is our latest LGBTQ acquisition. So the design was made in 2018 by Daniel Cassar, and is a redesign of the 1978 Pride flag by Gilbert Baker. And by adding a chevron including pink, yellow, and white, pink, and blue representing trans identities, and then black and brown lines representing people of color, but also people who have suffered or died from AIDS. The designer calls for more inclusivity within and outside of the community, but also calls for a more diverse society. The last object on that slide that I'd like to mention is one that I know Dan loves to talk about when he's leading the LGBTQ tours. And it's the orange flag here, which is called the Refugee Nation flag. And it was designed in 2016 by Yara Saeed. It's a flag that was made to represent the refugee theme of athletes participating to the Olympic Games in 2016. And it's a humbling object that reminds us that belonging to the LGBTQI plus community is still illegal in many countries, and has also been the reason of for people to fly their homes and countries many times. So we hope that by seeing this object in the space again, visitors will be reminded of the difficulties that the community faces in everywhere in the world. But I'll wrap things up, thanking you for the time that you spend listening to me, and also to tell you that the way with you curating is as a discussion and exchange, and so this is not an exhaustive list. So if there are things you would like to see displayed in space, if you have comments, queries, thoughts, like, please do interact with us using the hashtag design1900no, and would be happy to start chatting together. I'll now hand over to Liz Harper from the Royal Albert Hall. Looking forward to hear what you have to say.
Hi, thanks Maud, and that was really, really interesting. I love that gallery and I can't wait to come and visit the rehang now the V&A is open. So I'm Liz Harper, I'm the archive manager at the Royal Albert Hall, and we're celebrating our 150th anniversary, as Dan said, and I'm going to be looking at how the Hall has played a historic role in providing a safe space for London's LGBTQ plus communities, and also how in more recent times the Sage has been a platform for expressing a statement of pride. So next slide, please. So one of my favourite events and an early example of the Hall performing this role were at the Lady Malcolm Servants' Balls at the Hall from 1930 to 38. And in 2016, we worked with a post-gay independent arts outfit, as they like to call themselves, Ducky, who helped reenact the ball at Bishopsgate Institute, which was really fabulous. It actually started in 1923, but moved to the Royal Albert Hall in 1930 when it got really, really popular, because the hall could actually have about 10,000 people in it for balls. It was founded by Lady Malcolm, Lady Jeannie Malcolm, who you can see on the screen, and she was the only child of actress Lily Langtry. And it became a notorious party on London's LGBTQ plus scene. It provided 10,000 domestic servants, so that was the distinction here, to have a night of fancy dress, dancing until the small hours for a very reasonable cost. And Lady Malcolm specified that fancy dress had to be worn so that servants wouldn't feel embarrassed about not being able to afford fancy costumes, and there were prizes given out. In the vastness of our hall and in the anonymity of the huge crowds it gathered, and with the fancy dress element, it gave an opportunity for London's LGBTQ plus distinctively working classes to cross-dress, drag up, gender bend, and make contact in plain sight. Next slide. In 1934, a police report that you can see on the screen, this is from the National Archives, reported that young men of an effeminate type in coloured silk blouses and tight-hipped trousers, their faces rouged and powdered, dancing in the most objectionable way, and of disgraceful scenes of degenerate boys and men in female attire parading about. This was thought a problem by the organisers, and in 1935 the ticket, which you can see bottom middle, actually included the warning that no man impersonating a woman and no person unsuitably attired will be admitted. However, despite there having to be a board of scrutineers on the doors approving men's costumes, the queer community still got in. And in 1937, the police wrote that although homosexualists generally seem to be attracted to costume balls, it appeared to me that this dance attracts more men of the perverted type than any other held at the Royal Albert Hall. Quite an accolade. The last ball was held in 1938 prior to the war, and it was reported again in a police report that there was an extraordinary number of undesirable men at this ball who were unmistakably of the homosexual types. Next slide. Similarly to the Lady Malcolm's balls, the Chelsea Arts Club balls were lavish balls held at the hall, again filling up with crowds of nearly 10,000 people. The difference with these were they weren't specifically for the working classes, and they ran from 1910 to 1958 and attracted a huge amount of media attention. So there's lots of footage online if you're interested in these, mostly because they attracted lots of bohemians and artists and actors, and they had really lavish sets which were designed by theatre set designers. They had lots of orchestras, a carnival, a huge balloon drop, and people in rather scandalous fancy dress dancing until 5 a.m. Each one of the balls would be given a theme annually, such as prehistoric, and they were all the sets were themed on them. And at midnight, huge carnival floats designed by London art students would be absolutely destroyed by drunken revellers. Public nudity, drunken PDAs, fighting and unadulterated fun were rife. And again, similarly to the Lady Malcolm balls, the vastness of the hall with its gaslit corridors and curtained boxes, its dark staircases, meant that naughtiness was the order of the day. One participant who we spoke to as part of a recent oral history project, who witnessed the balls as a student, said that a lot of babies would be born 9 months later. Next slide. But the balls also provided a safe space for the LGBTQ plus community to meet and express themselves with unbridled creativity and quite like little inhibition, really. They weren't as heavily scrutinised as these weren't specifically for the working classes, I think. Partygoers could feel relatively free to be themselves and sort of go without the surveillance they underwent in their daily lives. For many men especially, this was an opportunity to wear drag, to dress outrageously, and to socialise unashamedly while never appearing to be really anything out of the ordinary. And there's some fabulous photos there. Next slide. In more recent years, the LGBT community haven't really had to hide in the crowds at the hall as it should be, but have been up front and centre stage. And from 1994 to 2001, we held the equality shows. And then in 2006, we held the Euro Pride show. And all these shows were organised by Sir Ian McKellen. The equality shows were raising money for Stonewall UK, the largest British and European charity for LGBTQ plus rights. And when they first started, they were actually the biggest ticketed gay and lesbian events ever held in the UK. The shows created some of the most iconic moments in the Royal Albert Hall's history, such as you can see Elton John there dragging up with Kylie Minogue rather fabulously. Next slide. They also featured people like Graham Norton, Lily Savage, Sandy Toksvig, Boy George, Eddie Izzard, Julian Clary, Martina Navratilova, and even Melanie Griffiths and Antonio Banderas. The Euro Pride show in 2006 was part of the 2-week-long Euro Pride Festival taking place in London that year. And you can see a fabulous Sir Ian McKellen in drag and Stephen Fry with his pants down there. And it also included a casting such as the London Gay Men's Chorus, Alan Carr and Sir Elton John once again. Next slide. And then I wanted to bring up the proms as well. So in 2019, there was a real display of LGBTQ plus pride at the last night of the prom specifically, which is often seen as a cornerstone of traditional values. However, mezzo-soprano Jamie Barton, who you can see in the picture with the pride flag, who identifies herself as bisexual, said she wanted to use the proms to make a very clear statement of pride. It's not just queer pride, it's a connective celebration of people being exactly who they are and loving who they are. And I'm honoured to get to lead that. As well as singing Judy Garland's gay anthem Over the Rainbow, she said it felt a little too on brand not to. Barton wore a gown featuring the colours of the bisexual flag, lavender, pink and blue, as a statement of the pride in my community. Rainbow coloured confetti rained down at the end as she waved the pride flag alongside the conductor's podium, which had been decorated with the pride flag by the promers. And this latter symbol has been present annually since 2015, beaming into millions of homes across the globe in a very subtle way. So next slide, in conclusion, that's just a taster of some of the LGBTQ history that we found looking back into the archives of the Royal Albert Hall. And we hope for the next 150 years that we provide a safe, inclusive and impactful platform for the LGBTQ plus community. Thank you. And back to Dan, I think.
Well, how exciting. That was such a wonderful, wonderful chat. So thank you so much to everybody. Just Liz, while I've got you here, maybe we should just follow up. That was an actual flag flying over the Royal Albert Hall.
Yeah, absolutely. Proudly there.
I love hearing about the idea that promers were involved in this. Like, tell me about how important that idea of community and the promers being a really important community in the Royal Albert Hall's history, being part of all this idea of celebrating pride.
Massively. So the proms has been at the Albert Hall since 1941, and the promers have very specific traditions, and at the last night of the proms they'll decorate the conductor's podium, and for many years it was sort of confetti and Union Jacks, but more and more we're seeing the pride flag, and hopefully I'm hoping the progress flag will get on there as well. And really, that's really important to us at the hall because we were designed as a hall for everyone. We're open to everyone, and we want our programming to reflect the diversity of the wider community that we serve.
Amazing. And I've got to say as well, Kylie Minogue in a rainbow dress. That's amazing.
I know. Kylie Christmas was one of the most fabulous events we ever had, and we sold more champagne at that event than any other.
Amazing. I mean, what is coming up that we might want to pin our flag to, put our flag on our hearts and walk into the Royal Albert Hall to see?
Well, check our website. Things are changing all the time. Obviously, for the next 2 months, we've got the proms and the BBC proms at the hall. So check out the last night of the proms because that will be streamed live on the BBC. So check out there and have your eyes peeled for the pride flag centre stage.
Thank you so much, Liz. Now, of course, everybody, throw your questions in if you want. I'm going to be putting them around to everybody. But it is great to have you back with the proms because it isn't a summer unless there is the proms. So it is a delight now to know that summer is coming finally. Florence, I'm going to come to you now for a bit of a chat about your presentation because you can't put a slide that says Bonobo Clitorises and then just skip over it. Can you tell me more? And also just how having a diverse research team may also lead to more research understandings, more diverse understandings of science as well, and how that all works out. Why that is important.
Yeah, sure, Dan. I mean, so yeah, a start, perhaps this one means to go on. Yeah, so the really interesting thing about Bonobo Clitorises, and this is one of the things that kind of was part of Josh's research, and one of the things that he also talks about, I think, in the virtual tour. So what's really interesting is there is a hypothesis that because there's a lot of what one might call same-sex intimacy amongst bonobos, and there's a hypothesis that this might have actually impacted how their vulva is shaped. So, for example, the actual position of the clitoris is technically more easily and completely stimulated when, say, two female bonobos practice genital rubbing. That's the official scientific term, but yeah, than when, say, a male and a female bonobo have sex. And that's kind of why I kind of did the little shout out about some of the myths about how like sex is primarily for procreation, because actually what we see in nature is that no, this is absolutely not the case. Sex is as much a means of communication and enjoyment and social gathering, just similar as it is amongst humans. So yeah, but in terms of the second question, yeah, the question about, you know, the impact of having a diverse research team and how that impacts kind of understandings of science and what stories we tell. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it is very obvious, but yes, there is, I think it does impact both the kind of questions that you ask, because as I mentioned before, nobody is objective, and we've kind of got this myth about science that somehow the scientist is the one who is like this objective viewer in the world. But like the questions you ask are informed by your background and what is normal for you. And so if you come from like a different culture that has perhaps slightly different understandings of gender or gender roles, if you're marginalized in some way, whatever your lived experience is, that's just going to impact the questions you ask. And when you're in a diverse team, you feel comfortable to ask those questions. You feel more comfortable because, you know, other people are different and people aren't going to like shun you or be rude to you or kind of push you away for asking and questioning what other people perceive as normality.
It's very much in terms of the way that you sort of break down the human connotation that's applied to the understanding of animal society, for example. I think when we're talking about the bonobos, for example, that is very much part of it all as well. And so the ability to understand that the animal kingdom doesn't adhere to the human rules, I think is quite important, isn't it? It's something that I imagine must come out of this wonderful interactive walkthrough of the Natural History Museum as well that Josh puts on. Can you tell me just a little bit more about it so that people do go to see it as well?
Yeah, for sure. So that was very much a collaboration. Josh and Liz Tilley, as I mentioned, who's an absolute editing and filming marvel. And yeah, the question it's always been like, what are the ways of making this tour and the content much more embedded and reaching a much wider audience? And so the format of the tour is, it starts off like any other popular science video on YouTube, and then you get to choose what the next thing you want to hear about is, and so you kind of you are almost following the tour, but it's almost like a choose your own adventure type thing, but but obviously about queer natural history. And it's also super cool because you get to have like little behind the scenes chats as well with some of the scientists and the researchers who can talk a bit more about the research they do around the specimens that Josh is kind of revealing all these really interesting stories and narratives about.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I can't wait to go on it now. This little choose your own adventure. Perfect weekend. Aidan, I'm going to come to you actually, and I'm going to just let this idea sort of sit with everybody as well, so that maybe we'll come back to you and have a suggestion from you. But I mean, everybody loves Attenborough, David Attenborough, Aidan. I think so. I think the thing is, if we were going to look at monuments, and we're going to say let's create a spot on Exhibition Road to create monuments for somebody who's is fabulous in terms of LGBTQ plus fieldwork. So your posit was, what if Attenborough was queer? Who do we have out there who is queer, who are great examples of, being wonderful people, but also being able to bring all this together? So who do you find inspiring, and who would you put on a plinth?
Who would I put on a plinth? This is a big question. I feel like I can't properly answer that because I'm quite skeptical about the idea of any one person taking up that mantle successfully. Because I mean, what we're dealing with here is the sort of silencing over a huge span of time all of these different people's experiences and the continuing silencing or exclusion of people today. And so I think any memorialization of one person runs the risk of potentially ignoring or sidelining others. But maybe a sculpture, maybe some sort of plaque that sort of speaks to a more pluralistic message would be great. But in terms of people, I mean, Twitter is this absolute hub of support and encouragement from LGBTQ plus researchers dealing with these issues. I mean, even in my own work, like asking a question on Twitter and being having the generous support of people at all different stages of their academic careers, just there to sort of lend a hand. with advice and encouragement. That's really what the kind of welcoming community is about. It's like a very self-made thing, and I think it's that's also putting pressure on institutions, putting pressure on organizations to do better too. But then from my own, I mean, just one example, I was thinking, if I had to choose someone, I wouldn't choose this person for lots of reasons, because as well with any LGBTQ plus researcher, they also come loaded with their own problems, their own issues. Memorializing them runs the risk of ironing out their own problems in terms of their historical contribution or legacy. But there's one archaeologist from the 1920s, again, an archaeologist in the 1920s, so mixed up with colonialism and empire. So I would be very hesitant to memorialize them. But it's this British archaeologist called Lancaster Harding, who was involved in doing digs in Palestine and Jordan. And it's less for his work there that he's an interesting figure, but more his sort of diaries and archival sort of notes that he took about life working in a research team at that time, including with his partner, this guy called Hassan. And it was actually through the archival record that you see how he felt able to be gay, be homosexual in Palestine, because being that way in Victorian England was so stifling and oppressive. So it's these little histories as well that through the kind of course of doing the research, you kind of get at the kind of complicated realities of people's lives. I think there's a story there that really resonated, but certainly a very problematic figure. I wouldn't put him on a plinth.
I think that was a very well reasoned answer there, because I think, yeah, both Florence and I were nodding away. I think you're right. You're probably right. You know, single monuments probably aren't great. Maybe it should be things that, you know, like Maud's got at the V&A. It's an abstract representation of so many people, isn't it? This wonderful progress flag. But I'll come to you in a moment, Maud. But just to stay with you, just for one more question, Aidan, you mentioned that idea of advice. I'd love to find out if somebody said something to you at some point in your career that you thought was a really good piece of advice, especially the way that you were sort of saying, you know, it's tricky being out in the field. And what would you now pass on to a younger person coming out into the field now as well? Well,
I think one of the key bits of advice I would give is that we don't need to accept that. And I think that there was definitely a certain degree of I don't know, acquiescence to that when I was maybe doing some of my earlier research, at feeling like I'm feeling this uncomfortableness about having to put certain parts of my own identity whilst doing field research. But that's just the way it has to be. And actually, what's been so interesting about working on this project and working with partner organizations and other people facing these issues is that actually collectively that demand that this can be better, that we can ask for more proactive support, that there are things that universities, that institutions can and should be doing more proactively. That would be my advice, that never be afraid to actually say you feel uncomfortable, because it's in that uncomfortableness that things can change, I think.
Amazing, thank you. Maud, coming to you now with that idea of the sort of the collective. I think what's really great is when we found out that 1900 Now was being redisplayed, the design, I gather, was being redisplayed. You know, we, as volunteer guides, we put our hand up and said, can you please have LGBTQ plus objects that we can take people to and tell us about? And you really delivered on this. But I think what I'd love to know is how having sort of a long-standing LGBTQ plus working group at the V&A sort of helps you as a curator, you know, in terms of thinking beyond just what you do in the curatorial department, but across the museum. You know, how does having this working group sort of help have equality, diversity, inclusion at the heart of all your choices?
Well, it's been amazing. We've been working quite closely together, and like for people that don't know about the group is composed of like staff from the museum, but like literally from like every single department. So we've got people from curatorial, for visitor experience, from like the loan section, like literally every single department. And we meet like on a monthly basis, and we do like discuss like the type of events we could put together, and like discuss like some ideas, some like things we want to experiment with. And like the group has like initiated a lot of projects that are like really interesting, like from like having like gender neutral bathrooms in the museum, but also like leading the program of like the Pride Month. And like in the context of this project, it was kind of like to consult with us, like when we wanted to acquire the Pride flag, for example. We wanted to make sure that this was the right object, that we were going to display it like in a way that will be like inclusive and representative and all those things. And so like consulting with them has been like invaluable. And yeah, I think we did push, like the goal of the gallery was also to reflect like a globalized world and like show as many like identities, feel like let people feel represented in the space. And so I don't think we could have done a good job if it weren't for like the help of the LGBTQ plus group, for example, but also young audiences that were really keen to see that kind of things as well. So we're very grateful. Yeah,
that's a great point as well, because I'll expand this to everybody now. It's that idea of the community involvement in this. I know, Florence, you mentioned that in your talk, and Liz, I'd love to find out how, you know, we've kind of talked about the promise, but how this might expand out as well. But Maud, what does it mean to you to sort of have the progress flag in the collection? And you know, what happens when we have the next iteration? We've got one at the moment. I think intersex triangle added. It's a yellow triangle. The purple circle. How do we kind of keep on moving forwards as our community becomes more diverse and more inclusive as well?
Well, we've seen like that's like a good question about like why acquiring this flag over another one. I think like the first answer is that the intersex one didn't exist when we first acquired, but I think in terms of design, the progress is like a really interesting one because it actually became a blueprint in itself, because like all the redesigns are now taking like the same design that Daniel Cassar developed. And interestingly, Cassar's like idea of the Progress Pride flag is very flexible. So like after having released the Progress flag with like the trans identity at the foreground and people of color and people suffered from AIDS, they actually developed like a series of stickers with like interchangeable background and chevron, so that everyone could like, you know, feel represented, like play with it. And like I think that's like the idea that's like promoted. And in terms of like acquiring future flags, I think what is important for like to me, but I think to the museum, to like the team that's been working in those galleries, is that anything is acquired, like not anything is acquired, but things can be acquired like as the result of a discussion. So that's why we use a hashtag. That's why we are asking for people to get back to us, like comment, and like if like the feedback is like positive, negative, whatever, like whatever you feel like, you know, like as a curator, I feel like I'm like just between the institution and the public, but it's not my voice that has to be represented. So I think like, you know, I'm kind of like easing that kind of like dialogue. So if that's what you want to see, like please like reach out, and like we will look into that and see what else we can put on display.
Thank you. We've got just a bit of time left, so I'm going to go around the circle in the order of everybody's presentations. Just ask you for one to think about what you'd like to say to your audience, to all your communities. What would you like to say to them to let them know really that they are welcome at our institutions? And I'm just going to answer a few questions that have come in as well. There's a question as to what was the movie that Maud had mentioned. It was 1979 movie Race Step, called the Homosexual Century. I probably got that wrong. And also the pronunciation that was, but also Shireen Lincoln says pluralistic approaches to monuments, adore, exclamation mark, for five of them, exchange. It's a change I want to see, which is great. But tell me, everybody, to go around the circle now, what is it that you will say to your communities? What is the sort of change that we are trying to bring about? And what do you want to say to them to make them feel welcome?
Oh, I mean, one thing I really would love to say is let people know that there are LGBTQ plus people from all different backgrounds within our institution. And we do want to make that difference. Like everything that I've discussed is really ground up. You know, there was no one from the top saying, oh, queerness is cool now, let's do this. Actually, this was us looking at what our community needs and putting together and working collaboratively. And putting our spare time and resources into doing that. And so if there's anything I want to say is like, we are there, we are inside, talk to us, let us know, critique. Don't ever feel that you can't or that no one will listen, because we have been listening and we want to make that change more perhaps than people at the top. And actually that's what matters, right? It's us as a community coming together.
Fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. I would, I think, really echo that. What I was saying in the presentation earlier was about visibility or inclusion not being one specific thing that we're here to talk about and define, but actually it's like a process. It's got to be identified through conversation, and that's going to continually change. And I think in the context of fieldwork, that's going to be a process where people are invited to get involved, will naturally be involved by virtue of being LGBTQ plus. And so in terms of working with people who have got these diverse experiences in fieldwork contexts, we're a community. We're here for each other, and please get in touch.
Yeah, museums are not neutral, and everyone should be represented.
That's in short. Thank you. Liz, any more thoughts?
Well, I just wanted to say, from the perspective of being the Hall's archivist, it's been really, really interesting to reassess some of our history, however problematic or undiverse it's been, and also like address that, and also try and like pick out some of the hidden histories and stories that I shared. And it's been really, really interesting doing things like oral history and having that first-hand documentation of people's experience, and also looking at other collections such as the National Archives and finding kind of the underground histories there have been fascinating. And also, you know, we've talked about the proms at the Albert Hall, but the Albert Hall has always been a platform for radical change. It's held everyone from the suffragettes to, you know, we've got environmentalists and all sorts using our platform for change. And we're not just a music venue. We want to represent every part of society and be open to all. So also, if you come to the Albert Hall at the moment, we've got an exhibition called Radical Albert Hall, which charts that history.
Amazing. Thank you. I mean, I think this is the thing. We've created these spaces and we're trying to make them safe spaces so that you can come in and explore these things that we've presented to you today. So I think that's certainly a great way to kind of remind everybody, Liz, that these are the spaces for you. This is your space, and we have existed across place, time and culture. So we've always been there, and we're always going to continue to be there. So so if you are from the LGBTQ plus community, do come and see us. Now, we are going to finish up. It has been such a delight. This is part of a continuing conversation, though. We will have another one of these before we come to the Great Exhibition Road Festival that is in October. So I think I already said it was 5 to 13, I think, or 9 to 13. Double check the website. All the details are on there. But if you have been watching on YouTube and we didn't get to your thoughts or comments or questions, don't worry about it. This will remain on YouTube and we'll try our best to respond to it. But a recording will be there and you'll be able to share it with your friends and colleagues. And for all the future Explore at Home live events as well, they will be put into the festival channel, which this is where this is going to be now. So there'll also be an evaluation form that we put in there, so you can tell us what you thought about this event. We really appreciate your feedback. Amazing is spelt with 5 Z's and 5 exclamation marks. And that's it for me. So thank you so much to Florence, to Aidan, to Maud, to Liz, and all the organizations that you represent, and all the fantastic projects, and all the people that are attached to that as well. It is a massive community that makes all this happen. So thank you so much for joining us and celebrating LGBTQ plus histories with us today. So good afternoon and have a great weekend.